Through a divine miracle, a long-dying civilization received, for the first time since the adoption of their only God, his benevolence, receiving the gift of immunity to the most deadly and devastating plague in the history of humanity. Thanks to this, the dying civilization had the opportunity to revitalize itself and return to its former glory, and remind the descendants of those barbarians who destroyed everything that was once theirs, that they were the legitimate heirs of that civilization, that Rome had returned. But now, with the plague to which they were blessed with immunity having finished destroying the known world, and therefore no longer having any special advantage over their rivals and enemies, will those fierce and proud bearers of the true Western civilization be able to survive the coming challenges? Hello everyone, and welcome to this video, which could be considered my first sequel to an alternate scenario I already made, except for collaborations, of course. Therefore, I highly recommend that you have watched the first part of this story to have as much context as possible about this alternate timeline. And without anything else to say, let's begin with part 2 of Eastern Rome being immune to the Black Death. In the last part of this alternate timeline, we left the story around the beginning of the 15th century. Eastern Rome rose from the ashes as once again a strong and wealthy empire and state, and a people who could once again impose their conditions on the powerfuls of Europe and the Middle East. And even though by that point the Black Death had almost completely vanished, the psychological effects of that terrible time remained in the collective mind of all the people surrounding Eastern Rome. The absolute immunity that the loyalty to the empire offered from the Black Death created a new generation of Europeans and Middle Easterners defectors, all taking refuge in Eastern Rome and swearing total loyalty and devotion to Roman culture, the emperor, and the Orthodox religion. Therefore, not only was the European population massively reduced by the terrible effects of the Black Death, wars, and famines, but also by the millions of deserters from their homelands who decided to immigrate to Eastern Rome to survive the calamities and atrocities caused by the Black Death. Due to this mass migration event, Eastern Rome now had a gigantic population of 20 million inhabitants, while the rest of Western Europe had around 30 million, a number monstrously inferior to our reality for that time. They also recovered many of their former territories, re-annexing the Serbian Empire, the Bulgars, and having fully recovered Anatolia as an integral part of the empire, with the majority of Turkish populations having been re-assimilated into the empire, expelled, or simply eliminated. Also, foreign colonies, mainly Italians, were fully re-annexed by Eastern Rome, with most settlers merging with the local population and accepting this reintegration, preferring to desert their homelands in exchange for a better chance of survival by becoming completely immune to the Black Death. But although the empire had regained a size it had not seen since the time of Basil II, its influence extended far beyond its borders. As I mentioned before, the psychological impact of Eastern Rome's immunity to the Black Death was enormous on the collective memory of the Old World. This psychological impact was the Eastern Romans' greatest weapon in regaining their former lands and legitimacy with the other great powers surrounding them, especially in the religious matters. Think about it. If a group belonging to a religion and its specific variant that they practiced were magically blessed without any rational explanation with total immunity to the plague that wiped out half the population of an entire continent, where would that leave the rest of the religions in the world? Definitely not in a very good position. And thanks to this, Eastern Rome was able to reaffirm the legitimacy of Orthodoxy as the true religion and the only legitimate Christian variant above Catholicism, as that branch of Christianity had failed to offer protection to its followers from the devastating Black Death, something that Orthodoxy was able to do in front of the astonished eyes of millions, with people able to walk among the dying sick men without getting something, or with those same dying sick men being cured instantly after swearing loyalty to the empire and its emperor. And in a highly religious and superstitious society and culture, that absolutely supernatural fact would be too powerful to be ignored by millions of poor and starving people with an unparalleled survival instinct in times as harsh as the Black Death to accept anything in order to be blessed with immunity to such a plague. Ironically, within the lore of my alternate timeline that I created, being immune to the Black Death had nothing to do with converting or not converting to Orthodoxy, but rather with serving and giving your loyalty to the Eastern Roman Empire, nothing more. But again, in a highly religious society like the European kingdoms and empires, it was inevitable that the elites and emperors would take advantage of this supernatural event to increase the power of influence and reach of their religion. It was thus that in the last part we saw how some kingdoms or empires, desperate to obtain divine legitimacy to protect their population diminished by the Black Death, converted to orthodoxy, and although, as I said, in reality, that did not give them any immunity, at least it granted them the blessing, protection, and alliance of Eastern Rome, being, for example, what happened with the Kingdom of Hungary, abandoning Catholicism in favor of orthodoxy, an event that would have dizzyingly enormous ramifications and changes for the future, especially in relation to the Holy Roman Empire and the rise of the Habsburg dynasty later. But for the time being, with a strong ally in Central Europe to serve as a buffer between them and the rest of the Western powers, still at war, facing demographic crisis and civil strife over religious legitimacy, especially related to the legitimacy of Catholicism, Eastern Rome would know that for the time being, those powers did not represent the most urgent threat to its revived empire. They understood that these were no longer the days of Justinian, when the only priority seemed to be to reconquer the Western territories to restore the Roman Empire to the extent of the glorious days of the Pax Romana. No, they knew they had more important matters to attend to, especially with their eastern borders with the Muslim world. But before focusing on the possible eastern reconquest of the Romans, let's look at the military power they would have had by the beginning of the 15th century in this alternate timeline. As I said at the end of the previous part, the Eastern Roman Empire could have had a population of around 20 million inhabitants, massively helped by the higher birth rate of its inhabitants during the Black Death due to them being fully immune to the plague, but also by the massive exodus of millions of Europeans from all kingdoms, but especially from France and Italy, who came to escape wars and diseases with the prospect of a better life and a better future for their children and grandchildren. With that massive population, with a majority being indebted for having been welcomed into the empire, it is quite realistic to assume that at least 1% of that population could represent the total military strength of the empire, that is, 200,000 men. Technologically speaking, the army would have been massively modernized during this Eastern Roman revival, following a similar path to the Ottoman Empire in our timeline in that regard, but more rapidly and a few decades earlier. You have to keep in mind that the Renaissance, in this reality, would have begun a few decades earlier and focused on the Hellenic world, not the Italian, Western European one, especially without the massive exodus of thousands of Greeks bringing their knowledge to the different Italian states. But the Renaissance was never solely about rediscovering classical ideas and knowledge from antiquity. That was only one aspect of it. It was also a rebirth in the civilizational sense, about finally overcoming the dark times and stagnation of the Middle Ages, especially during its final centuries after the Fourth Crusade until the end of the 100 Years' War. I'm aware that today it has become taboo and a sign of mockery and ignorance to continue using the argument that the Middle Ages were a period of stagnation or even a civilizational decline because they were the Dark Ages, but personally, I think there are nuances we need to consider in this regard. Yes, of course, not everything was horrible in every era of the long history of the Middle Ages. Of course, there were advances and early rediscoveries after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, but stagnation goes far beyond just the technological, military, or architectural aspects. There is also the intellectual aspect, the development of logic, pragmatism, the restraint of suspicions, debate in the classical Hellenistic style, the taboo against certain types of iconoclasm that limited art for almost a millennium from its true potential and aesthetics, which the Greeks and Romans of old had already demonstrated. And, of course, many cases of extremism of Christian arrogance that attested to its hypocrisy, such as the terrible civilizational and spiritual failure of the Crusades, especially the Fourth, or the execution of Joan of Arc, for example. That's why I'm more of the opinion that we need to add nuances to this argument, which everyone today rejects or mocks as archaic for understanding history. Yes, of course, it wasn't all setbacks and dark times, but considering the Middle Ages a high or shining point in Western history is also, in my opinion, an exaggeration that deserves its nuances. After that digression, back to what I was saying before. Yes, the Renaissance was also a rebirth in the civilizational sense, about finally overcoming the dark times and stagnation of the Middle Ages. And with Eastern Rome having been magically blessed with immunity to the worst plague that history has ever recorded, they would consider the push for creativity and innovation as an absolute legitimacy for having the approval of the Almighty, which in the long term could be something dangerous to develop extremisms that could develop in that context of personal religious reinforcement, although no longer institutional, but that perhaps we will see if there is a third part of this video. So, militarily speaking, I think that by the early to mid-15th century, Eastern Rome would have modernized its military in a very similar way to the Ottomans, a little earlier and much more rapidly. By that point, with 200,000 men, the majority of the soldiers would be composed of light infantry, mainly composed of Serbs, Bulgarians, French and Italians, descendants of those same peoples who made a massive exodus to Eastern Rome to escape the problems of Europe caused by the wars of their kingdoms or the Black Death. There would also be some heavy cavalry, a revival of heavily armored lancers with plate armor and lamellar influence, supported by local noble retinues, mostly native Greeks. Light cavalry, steppe-style units from mostly Georgia, Armenia, and Balkan converts, composed of scouts, skirmishers, and mounted archers. And of course, the most important and revolutionary for the time were gunpowder units with arquebusiers, early handgunners, and crews for bombards and cannons. Mostly deployed in sieges or defensive lines, especially at first, but rapidly expanding. But for a time, these would compose a minor force within the empire's army, not being composed of more than a few thousand men, due to the extremely expensive cost of manufacturing gunpowder weapons, adopting more of a strategic defensive role, very useful for protecting borders or walls of large and important cities. But yes, eventually, things like siege bombards, like bronze or iron artillery, based on Italian and Balkan designs, comparable to Ottoman use at Constantinople, will appear in the empire, and surely before the Ottomans in our reality. Also, early hand cannons and arquebuses, not yet widespread, but used by elite troops and palace guards. The empire would do everything to rapidly modernize its military by adopting every weaponry innovation they could with gunpowder, funding monumental production of workshops around key and important cities of the empire to manufacture all these new weapons and technology. The Eastern Roman Empire would adopt gunpowder more rapidly than the Ottoman Empire, due to having a strong contact with Italy and former mercenaries and their expertise superior to Eastern Romans in those things, state-sponsored investment and interest from emperors, and religious and imperial zeal to match Western innovation. But again, the Renaissance was about both, rediscovering forgotten ideas of the past and overcoming medieval stagnation to thrive on the innovation of new concepts. And one of those rediscoveries of things from the past that were forgotten would be Greek fire. Probably its formula having been forgotten after the Fourth Crusade, I have no doubt that in this reborn Eastern Roman Empire, scholars and other geniuses that the empire would have formed or received from European exoduses would finally manage to rediscover the formula for Greek fire, and in the absence of yet having the perfected technical knowledge for the use of firearms with gunpowder on a large scale, Greek fire would be a good alternative to begin to regain a massive advantage over its enemies. Likely revived in its use, yes, but updated. It would likely be mostly used in naval combat, like flamethrower-equipped dromons, modernized, of course, since the early Middle Ages, but also for siege defense, with Greek fire being thrown from walls or siphons, and being a huge symbol for the reminder it represented for their enemies then Rome has returned, being a huge naval dominance advantage in the Eastern Mediterranean and a psychological terror for the victims of such a fire. And speaking about navies, the total size of their fleet could easily reach 200 to 300 ships composed of dromons, galleys, and merchant convoys. They would use them for gunpowder naval warfare, ships equipped with cannons, similar to early Venetian and Ottoman navies, but also with Greek fire, of course, with the huge influence of Italian descendants being extremely useful for their naval and commercial experience that would have been passed down from father to son. With such military power, but also soft power due to their religious influence and divine legitimacy for having been the chosen ones immune to the Black Death, the empire could easily continue expanding by taking advantage of the chaos and often inferior population of its neighbors. By the early 15th century, Eastern Rome could try to expand into the Caucasus, reasserting its authority in those territories, supported by the now Roman province of Georgia, and by the legitimacy of proclaiming themselves as liberators of Christian peoples oppressed by Muslims. Indeed, many Armenians historically resented Muslim dominance, like the Seljuks, Mamluks, and later Ottomans. If Eastern Rome reemerges as a strong, Orthodox protector of Eastern Christians, with divine legitimacy for their miraculous immunity to the Black Death, still vivid in their collective memories from a few decades ago, many would welcome integration, especially with, once again, memory of the plague in mind. After this enormous blow to the Islamic world, an even worse one was about to come, with the next objective of Eastern Rome being to destabilize and weaken the influence and commercial power of the Muslim world by regaining control of most of the trade routes to India and Asia, in addition to reaffirming its holy legitimacy by reconquering the Levant. The Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt by the early 15th century was still a major Islamic power in the region, but in a weakened and unstable phase, having suffered immensely from the Black Death, internal dynastic conflicts, and economic disruption. They were no longer at their peak, but not in full decline either, more like a tired giant, so to speak, still capable of defending itself, but vulnerable to external or internal shocks. Around that time, the Burji dynasty had just come to power in 1382 under Sultan Barkuk. The Burji period was marked by rapid turnover of sultans, power struggles, and growing instability. Like just telling that between 1382 and 1422, there were 15 different changes of sultan, often via coup, already tells you everything you need to know to understand how unstable this period was for their government. Furthermore, the ravages of military power caused by the Black Death were evidently still affecting the number of men they could muster for a territory as large as theirs, not to mention that they were historically among the last to adopt modernized doctrines, in addition to the adoption of gunpowder, making them very vulnerable to a sudden attack by a revived Eastern Roman Empire with superior numbers of men, superior weaponry, and a strong and highly prepared naval fleet equipped with multiple firearms and Greek fire flamethrowers. Therefore, under these circumstances, I think that after a few years of military campaigning, but also religious propaganda among the oppressed Christian minorities, like the Maronites, Melkites, some Armenians in the area, Syriac Christians, and some Copts that were still Christian after all these centuries and living in the conquered area, although it would not be an easy task, the empire could finally recover the Levant from the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt. After this impressive victory and reconquest, which would further accentuate their holy legitimacy, would the Eastern Romans try to go further and even try to reconquer Egypt? I don't think so. As I mentioned earlier, the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt may no longer be at the height of its power, but it had not yet entered a state of absolute decline in all aspects of its society that would not allow it to offer any kind of resistance. They were still a formidable regional force, especially in their core territory of Egypt. A hasty overextension by the Eastern Romans could ruin the massive momentum they had achieved with the advantage of having been immune to the Black Death. They would simply understand that it was not yet the time, but I had no doubt that, like the Ottomans a century later in our timeline, eventually, the reconquest of Egypt would be a plausible prospect for this revitalized empire. However, I think that strategically, to further weaken the Sultanate economically, they would create a buffer zone in the Sinai Peninsula, completely cutting off the Muslim world between Africa, Arabia, and the Middle East, dealing a deep blow to that civilization and its different kingdoms and empires, with Eastern Rome also regaining control of most of the trade routes in the area and reducing the power and influence of the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt to its minimum extent, probably also with the territories on the west coast of Arabia being liberated and made independent from its control as a result of such losses. While all this was happening in the east, in the west, things were going from bad to worse for the European powers. The Pope of Rome would have lost all credibility and legitimacy as the spiritual and institutional leader of Christianity, because while the world watched Eastern Rome rise from the ashes, completely immune to the Black Death, and with a birth rate that would make any kingdom of the time blush, in Europe, famine, wars, and hunger continued uninterrupted for decades. And even with the effects of the Black Death behind them, wars, dynastic conflicts, and above all, religious conflicts would continue. By that point, Catholicism's institutional control of Christianity would have been completely fragmented, resulting in multiple revolts by different representatives of the religion throughout Europe, similar to what would happen decades later with the Protestant revolts, with all European kingdoms having to manage and neutralize these revolts in the most brutal ways possible, adding to the massive depopulation that this part of the world had already suffered in recent decades. Kingdoms or empires such as France, England, the Holy Roman Empire, Castile, and others would attempt to reinforce their holy legitimacy by putting popes elected by the elites of those kingdoms in charge of regional control of Christendom, similar to how in our reality the Pope of Rome fled to Avignon for a time, or how the Holy Roman Empire created an anti-pope, but on a larger, more chaotic and confusing scale. Defragmentation and disunity would be the norm in this new Europe of this alternate timeline. Think of the different European kingdoms being administered in a much more fragmented and chaotic way, such as, for example, the Holy Roman Empire was at that time, and even more later during the early modern era. In this context, and with its eastern borders more or less stable and secured from any upcoming threat, Eastern Rome would finally set its sights on the prospect of reconquering its influence in the West. As you may have noticed, this video is quite chaotic in its order and covers different events at different times that do not occur at the same time depending on the place on the map we are talking about. And another aspect that I have not been able to cover until now is how the Eastern Romans would affirm and expand their influence through methods other than military means: marriages. Eastern Roman women were historically married to foreign kings and emperors, like it was the case for Anna Komnena or Sophia Paleologina, the latter being the reason, for example, that Russia could get the legitimacy of calling itself the Third Rome. And keep in mind that this was a prestige that could be obtained from members of dynasties of an empire and a culture that had already completely fallen by that point. But now, imagine in this alternate timeline how prestigious and divinely legitimate it would be to marry into the powerful families and elites of Eastern Rome. It would be something that would be enormously worth it for many. Thanks to that fact, and the previous rapprochement that the Kingdom of Hungary had with Eastern Rome in the previous part, I think that an eventual unification between Hungary and Eastern Rome would be possible through arranged marriages between their different dynasties, further expanding the Eastern Roman and Orthodox influence. With those events, tensions would increase massively with the Holy Roman Empire, but with it being in a state of increasing fragmentation, and with the emperor's authority being very theoretical compared to the true authority that belonged to the different independent states and dukes, and with those still recovering from the depopulation they suffered during the Black Death, and from religious events that would have been accelerated perhaps in this reality, such as the Western Schism between 1378 and 1417, or its equivalents, would have made that theoretical power, as Voltaire said, neither holy, nor Roman, nor an empire, and that would be even more true in this alternate timeline. With that, finally, the moment had arrived, the symbolically most important reconquest of Eastern Rome, the reconquest of Italy, and of the eternal city where it all began. With the peninsula divided, fragmented, and without papal influence present in its territories, plus the massive depopulation that the peninsula suffered during the years of the Black Death, and the exodus of hundreds of thousands or even millions of Italians to the Italian colonies of the Aegean Sea that would eventually reunite with Eastern Rome, the reconquest would be more of a formality than a true military challenge, although it would be a diplomatic challenge due to the possible reception of such an event. After all, Italy had long since forgotten what it meant to be a unified peninsula. They might have been considered one people, one culture, but definitely not one state with one unified politics. However, I think that the descendants of Italians who immigrated to the Eastern Roman Empire could be the key to appeasing the elites of the different independent Italian states, seeing this reconquest not as a foreign invasion, but as a legitimate reunification of one and only same people who had been forcibly separated long ago. And without a clear papal authority on the peninsula, and with the institutional legitimacy of Catholicism practically reduced to nothing, especially considering the influence that some Greek dynasties previously had in Italy, such as the Paleologos themselves, having relatives on the peninsula, I think that eventually the acceptance of a return to the Roman Empire, although very difficult, would be possible. Although this return would not be made without conditions, with the northern Italian states, richer and with stronger political foundations to define themselves as their own people, managing to maintain a partial independence, being considered as client states, technically under the control of the emperor in Constantinople in theory, but in practice, still independent, being a reunification more symbolic than literal for the prestige of the return of the true Rome and of the reunion of two brother peoples who had lost sight of each other a long time ago. But with this reconquest of the peninsula, Eastern Rome would now have new rivals and challenges to face on its new borders. rivals and challenges which he would try to neutralize strategically with various alliances of convenience and marriage arrangements between different families, especially with the Kingdom of Aragon, which at that time extended across Sicily and southern Italy. But if Eastern Rome played its cards well, with its prestige and religious legitimacy re-established, perhaps they could find common ground with the Aragonese, and perhaps through strategic marriages between their dynasties, they could unify Aragon, their main territory and colonies, with the Eastern Roman Empire, creating a gigantic domino effect with consequences for the future of the Kingdom of Castile and the foundations of what would become Spain in the future. And with this invaluable territorial and alliance contribution, Aragon could impose itself over Castile on the Iberian Peninsula, and with the help of Eastern Rome and its other allies, expand along its southern coasts and conquer the Nasrid Kingdom of Granada decades earlier when it actually happened with Castile. Meanwhile, with all these events happening, and with France clearly being on the losing side of this alternative 100 Years' War, I think that Eastern Rome could play their cards right, and find a strategic alliance of power between England and themselves along with their Italian and Aragonese allies through helping England in completely annihilating France in exchange for getting concessions of territories, especially the southeastern coast of France, maybe being annexed in Aragonese territory, maybe in Genoa, but in the end, in a Roman territory nonetheless. England would still dominate a vast territory, and through strategic alliances and marriages, would have secured a lasting diplomatic alliance and cooperation with Eastern Rome and its allies. And with that, we'll stop for now. We've definitely come a long way from the starting point of this crazy alternate history. It can now be said that we are no longer dealing solely with Eastern Rome, but with the true, revived Rome. There is still a lot to cover in this world, especially with the upcoming events, but I can already tell you that if Christopher Columbus existed in this timeline, he would not go to Portugal or Castile to ask for funding for his expeditions to the west, but rather to Rome, which would undoubtedly bring with it an even crazier story to consider if we continue exploring the events of that completely crazy alternate world where the immunity to one single plague would have changed everything. And with that, I think this is a good moment to end this video. I hope you people are still enjoying this story. And if you want a third part of this story, let's set a goal of 2,000 likes in order to keep exploring this crazy scenario of Eastern Rome that was immune to the Black Death. Anyway, don't forget to subscribe, like the video, become a member of the channel in order to have early access to new videos, and comment on what you thought of it. And without anything else to say, see you next time.